June 6, 1944. The world's fate balanced on a knife's edge as the largest amphibious invasion in history crashed onto the shores of Normandy. But while American headlines would soon be filled with stories of Omaha and Utah, a different kind of battle was unfolding just a few miles away. One that would rewrite the rules of war and leave even the most hardened U.S. generals stunned. Picture this: the icy Atlantic wind slamming into the faces of 14,000 Canadian soldiers, their landing craft tossed like toys in 10-foot waves. It's 7:45 a.m. The sky is a haze of fog, smoke, and tracer fire. Ahead, the infamous Atlantic Wall, Hitler's so-called impenetrable fortress, looms out of the mist, bristling with machine guns, artillery, and barbed wire. Every inch of sand is a death trap. Every expert, every American and British commander has warned that this beach, Juno Beach, will be a bloodbath. The Canadians are outnumbered, outgunned, and in the eyes of many, outclassed. But here's the twist. What happened next would shock the entire Allied command. American generals, watching from their command ships, expected disaster. Instead, they witnessed something that defied every military manual, every prediction, and every ounce of conventional wisdom. The Canadians didn't just survive. They broke through the Atlantic Wall faster and deeper than any other force on D-Day. And they did it by breaking every rule in the book. Why did this happen? How did a group of so-called colonial troops, dismissed by many as inexperienced and untested, pull off the most unexpected success of the Normandy landings? What secret did they know that the American and British High Command had missed? And why did their victory force the U.S. Army to rewrite its own playbook in the months that followed? This is the untold story of Juno Beach, the D-Day invasion that changed everything. It's a story of innovation born from desperation, of underdogs who refused to be underestimated, and of a battle plan so radical that it left even the most decorated American commanders questioning everything they thought they knew about war. If you think you know the story of D-Day, think again. The real shock wasn't at Omaha or Utah. It was here, on Juno Beach, where history's most overlooked soldiers rewrote the future of warfare. But the secret behind their success didn't start on the beaches of Normandy. It began years earlier, in the shadow of a disaster that nearly destroyed the Canadian Army and set the stage for one of the boldest gambles in military history. Before the world ever heard the name Juno Beach, the Canadian Army was haunted by a nightmare that American commanders knew all too well: the disaster at Dieppe. In August 1942, 2 years before D-Day, Canadian troops had been sent to storm the French coast in what was supposed to be a textbook amphibious assault. The plan was careful, methodical, and by the book, exactly the kind of operation that U.S. military strategists had studied for decades. But what happened at Dieppe would become a cautionary tale whispered in every Allied war room. The numbers were brutal. In just 9 hours, nearly 70% of the Canadian force was killed, wounded, or captured. The beaches ran red and the survivors carried scars, both physical and psychological, that would never fully heal. For American planners, Dieppe was a warning: follow the manual and you might walk straight into a massacre. For the Canadians, it was a wound that refused to close, a dark cloud that followed them across the Atlantic and into every training camp, every briefing, every sleepless night before D-Day. And the doubts didn't stop there. As the Allies prepared for the Normandy invasion, skepticism about the Canadians ran rampant through the highest levels of command. American generals, many of them veterans of North Africa and Sicily, looked at their northern allies with a mix of concern and condescension. Some called them colonial troops, a polite way of saying they weren't ready for the big leagues. Others quietly lobbied to give the Canadians an easier sector, far from the heaviest German defenses. After all, if the Americans and British, armed with the best equipment and the most experience, were nervous about the Atlantic Wall, what chance did the Canadians have? But the Canadians weren't just fighting the Germans, they were fighting the weight of low expectations. Every rumor, every whispered doubt, Every sideways glance from an American or British officer became fuel. The memory of Dieppe was a scar, but it was also a lesson. The Canadians knew what happened when you played it safe, when you followed the rules, when you hesitated on a hostile beach. They had seen the cost of caution, and they were determined never to repeat it. Behind the scenes, the pressure was intense. Canadian commanders faced relentless scrutiny from their American counterparts. Reports circulated through Allied headquarters, dissecting every aspect of Canadian training, equipment, and morale. Some U.S. officers even questioned whether the Canadians should be trusted with such a critical role on D-Day. The stakes couldn't have been higher. If the Canadians failed again, it wouldn't just be their own reputation on the line. It would be a blow to Allied unity, a propaganda gift to Hitler, and a potential disaster for the entire invasion. Yet in the midst of all this doubt, something unexpected was happening. The Canadians were quietly preparing for a different kind of fight. They were studying every detail of the Dieppe raid, analyzing every mistake, every delay, every moment of hesitation that had cost lives. They weren't just training harder, they were training smarter. And at the center of this transformation was a man who would become one of the most unlikely innovators of World War II, Major General Rod Keller. Keller wasn't a household name in the U.S., he didn't come from a famous military family, and he didn't have the pedigree of an Eisenhower or a Patton. But what he did have was a relentless drive to learn from failure. While others clung to tradition, Keller was asking dangerous questions. What if the experts were wrong? What if the safest way through a kill zone wasn't to pause and consolidate, but to move faster than anyone thought possible? What if the only way to survive was to break every rule in the book? As D-Day approached, the Canadians found themselves at a crossroads. The world expected them to play it safe, to follow the manual, to avoid another Dieppe. But Keller and his men were about to gamble everything on a new approach, one that would either save lives or end in catastrophe. The Americans watched with skepticism, the British with polite concern. But nobody, not even the most seasoned U.S. commanders, could have predicted what was about to unfold on Juno Beach. And as the first landing craft cut through the waves toward Normandy, the shadow of Dieppe loomed large. The Canadians knew the price of failure. But this time, they were determined to write a different ending, one that would force the world, and especially the United States, to see them in a whole new light. But what exactly was this radical new plan? And why did it terrify even the most experienced American military minds? The answer would change the course of history. In the months leading up to D-Day, as Allied planners pored over maps and intelligence reports, one name kept surfacing in hushed conversations: Major General Rod Keller. To most Americans, Keller was an unknown, a blunt, practical officer without the pedigree or polish of the famous U.S. generals. But behind closed doors, he was quietly preparing to unleash a plan so radical, so unorthodox, that it would send shockwaves through the entire Allied command. The standard doctrine for amphibious assaults was gospel in every American military academy. Move slowly. Land in carefully timed waves, 3 minutes apart. Let each group dig in, establish a foothold, and only then send the next wave. This was the method that had been drilled into U.S. Marines from Guadalcanal to Tarawa, the approach that every American officer trusted to minimize chaos and casualties. But Keller saw something the textbooks missed. He had studied the Dieppe disaster with a surgeon's precision, interviewing survivors, analyzing every minute of the timeline. The lesson was clear. Hesitation was fatal. The longer troops lingered in the open, the more they died. So Keller made a decision that would horrify the experts. He threw out the manual. Instead of 3-minute intervals, he ordered waves to land just 30 seconds apart. Instead of pausing to consolidate, he demanded relentless forward movement. Instead of caution, he wanted speed, pure, unbroken momentum. To the American and British advisors at Allied headquarters, it sounded like madness. They warned that troops would bunch up, that formations would dissolve, that chaos would reign. Some even predicted a disaster worse than Dieppe, one that could cripple the entire invasion. But Keller wasn't alone. Admiral Percy Nels, head of the Royal Canadian Navy, saw the same flaws in the old doctrine. He used his influence to back Keller's plan, pushing for months of intense training. Canadian troops drilled over and over, learning to ignore the instinct to take cover, to keep moving even when every nerve screamed to stop. They practiced landing under fire, advancing through smoke and confusion, trusting that speed was their only shield. The Americans watched these preparations with a mix of skepticism and curiosity. U.S. military observers sent back reports filled with warnings. The Canadians are violating every principle of amphibious warfare, one officer wrote. If they succeed, it will be a miracle. But there was something else in those reports, a grudging respect for the sheer audacity of the plan. In a war defined by innovation from radar to the atomic bomb, here was a tactical gamble that could change everything. And Keller wasn't stopping at new tactics. He demanded every advantage technology could offer. The Canadians brought more specialized tanks to Juno Beach than any other Allied force. These weren't just ordinary Shermans. They were Hobart's funnies, bizarre-looking machines equipped with mine flails, flamethrowers, and bridge-laying gear. American commanders had dismissed most of these vehicles as unnecessary for Omaha and Utah, but Keller wanted every tool at his disposal. He knew that breaking through the Atlantic Wall would take more than courage. It would take innovation. As D-Day approached, tension crackled through the Allied ranks. American generals debated the risks, British officers questioned the wisdom, and Canadian troops steeled themselves for what could be a one-way mission. The stakes were enormous. If Keller's plan failed, it would vindicate every critic and doom thousands of men. But if it worked, it would force the U.S. Army and the world to rethink everything they knew about modern warfare. The night before the invasion, as American and Canadian officers gathered for final briefings, the atmosphere was electric. Some U.S. advisors still argued for caution, urging Keller to reconsider. But the decision was made. The Canadians would hit Juno Beach with a speed and aggression no one had ever seen before. There would be no turning back. As dawn broke over the English Channel, the landing craft surged forward. The Canadians braced themselves, knowing they were about to test a theory that defied every rule in the book. American commanders watched from their ships, binoculars trained on the shoreline, waiting to see if this bold experiment would end in glory or disaster. What happened next would leave even the most battle-hardened U.S. generals speechless. The Canadians were about to prove that sometimes the only way to survive is to break all the rules, and in doing so, they would change the course of the war. But as the first boots hit the sand, no one could predict just how quickly the tide would turn. The morning of June 6, 1944, was unlike any other in military history. As the first Canadian landing craft surged toward Juno Beach, the stakes couldn't have been higher. American generals, watching from their command ships, braced for the worst. The plan was a gamble, one that defied every lesson the U.S. military had learned from years of brutal island hopping in the Pacific. But as the ramps dropped and the Canadians charged into the surf, what unfolded would become a case study in military innovation for generations of American officers. The chaos was immediate and overwhelming. 10-foot waves battered the landing craft, tossing men and machines like driftwood. The cold Atlantic water soaked uniforms and ammunition, chilling soldiers to the bone before they even reached the sand. German machine guns opened up with a roar, sending streams of tracer fire slicing through the morning haze. Mortar shells exploded in geysers of sand and seawater. The Atlantic Wall, built to be impenetrable, unleashed its fury. But here, where the story takes a turn that stunned every American observer, instead of pausing at the waterline, instead of huddling for cover as doctrine dictated, the Canadians did the unthinkable. They ran straight into the fire. 30 seconds after the first wave hit, another wave landed. Then another. Then another. The beach, instead of being a graveyard of isolated squads, became a living, surging river of men and machines. The relentless tempo left German gunners scrambling to keep up. Every time they zeroed in on a target, another group was already sprinting past. American officers, trained to expect careful, methodical advances, watched in disbelief. Reports flashed back to Allied headquarters: Canadians advancing too quickly, formations breaking down, risk of overextension. But the warnings went unheeded. On the ground, the Canadians pressed forward, driven by a sense of urgency that bordered on desperation. They knew the kill zone, the deadly stretch between the surf and the bunkers, was no place to linger. Every second spent on that sand was a second closer to death. And then came the tanks. Not just any tanks, but the legendary Hobart's Funnes, machines the Americans had largely rejected for their own landings. These engineering marvels rolled off the landing craft and immediately went to work. Mine-clearing tanks detonated hidden explosives, flamethrower tanks sent sheets of fire into enemy positions, and bridge-laying tanks spanned deadly ditches. The Canadians had embraced every tool, every innovation, every advantage they could muster. American commanders, watching from offshore, began to realize they might have underestimated just how effective these gimmicks could be. The result was organized chaos. Smoke and dust filled the air, obscuring friend from foe. Officers shouted orders above the din, NCOs rallied their men, and medics darted between craters to pull the wounded to safety. But through it all, the momentum never stopped. The Canadians kept moving, kept pushing, kept flooding the beach with fresh troops. The German defenders, trained to expect slow, cautious advances, found themselves overwhelmed by the sheer speed and aggression of the assault. By 8:15 a.m., just 30 minutes after the first landing, forward scouts sent back a report that would echo through Allied command. The Canadians had already penetrated 2 miles inland. For comparison, at Omaha Beach, American troops were still pinned down at the water's edge, fighting for every inch. At Utah, progress was slow and methodical. But at Juno, the Canadians were rewriting the playbook in real time. The psychological impact was immediate. German soldiers, expecting to repel a cautious enemy, instead faced an onslaught that gave them no time to regroup. American and British officers, watching from their ships, began to question everything they thought they knew about amphibious warfare. The old rules were being shattered before their eyes. And yet the gamble was far from over. Every minute, every yard gained came at a cost. Men fell. Equipment was lost. The risk of disaster still loomed. But the Canadians pressed on, driven by a determination that American observers would later describe as relentless and unstoppable. The momentum Keller had demanded was now a tidal wave, sweeping aside obstacles that had been expected to hold for days. As the sun climbed higher and the battle raged on, one thing became clear to every American watching. This was no ordinary assault. This was a masterclass in innovation under fire, a lesson in what happens when you dare to break the rules and trust in the courage of your troops. But the true test was still to come. Could the Canadians maintain their momentum as they pushed deeper into enemy territory? Or would the gamble that had stunned the world turn into a catastrophe before the day was done? The answer would not only decide the fate of Juno Beach, it would force the U.S. military to rethink everything it believed about victory, innovation, and the power of the underdog. As the morning wore on, the battle for Juno Beach transformed from a desperate gamble into a full-blown shockwave that rippled through the entire Allied command. American generals, glued to their binoculars on the decks of command ships, watched as the impossible unfolded before their eyes. The Canadians, once dismissed as inexperienced and untested, were not just holding their ground. They were surging forward, rewriting the rules of amphibious warfare in real time. By 8:30 a.m., just 45 minutes after the first boots hit the sand, Canadian engineers had already cleared 6 separate paths through the German defenses. They used Bangalore torpedoes to blast through barbed wire, tossed satchel charges into bunkers, and marked safe routes with white tape. The specialized tanks, those Hobart's Funnies that American planners had doubted, proved to be game changers. Mine-clearing tanks detonated deadly obstacles, flamethrower tanks sent German defenders fleeing, and bridge-laying tanks spanned trenches that would have stalled any conventional assault. The beach, once thought to be a death trap, became a highway for relentless Canadian momentum. American military advisors sent urgent messages back to headquarters. Canadians advancing too rapidly, risk of overextension, formations breaking down. But the warnings were quickly overshadowed by the results. The Germans, expecting to pick off isolated groups, found themselves overwhelmed by a continuous, unbroken stream of attackers. Every time they tried to regroup, another wave of Canadians was already on top of them. The old doctrine, 3-minute intervals, cautious advances, was being shattered in real time. The psychological impact on both sides was immediate and profound. German machine gunners, trained to mow down slow-moving targets, struggled to keep up with the relentless pace. Their carefully prepared kill zones were flooded with troops before they could reload. Panic began to spread through the German ranks. Officers shouted orders that were drowned out by the roar of tank engines and the thunder of artillery. Some defenders abandoned their posts, others surrendered outright. The Atlantic Wall, once touted as Hitler's unbreakable fortress, was crumbling under the weight of Canadian innovation. Meanwhile, on the American command ships, disbelief turned to admiration. General Omar Bradley, one of the most respected U.S. commanders, watched the Canadian advance with growing respect. He had been skeptical of the aggressive plan, fearing it would lead to disaster. But as he saw Canadian tanks and infantry racing inland, he realized he was witnessing something extraordinary. One of his colonels, James Rudder, summed it up perfectly. The Canadians fight like they've got something to prove. It wasn't just a compliment. It was a recognition that the underdogs had found a way to turn doubt into fuel. The contrast with other beaches was impossible to ignore. At Omaha, American troops were still pinned down by withering fire, fighting for every inch of sand. At Utah, progress was steady but cautious. But at Juno, the Canadians were already pushing into the French countryside, liberating towns and villages hours ahead of schedule. French civilians, stunned by the speed of the advance, poured into the streets waving hidden flags and offering food and wine to their liberators. The timeline of liberation had been rewritten in a single morning. The momentum Keller had demanded was now unstoppable. Every minute more troops and equipment poured ashore. Supply lines, expected to take days to establish, were thrown together in hours. Trucks, jeeps, and tanks rolled off landing craft and headed straight for the front. The beach, once a battlefield, was rapidly transforming into a supply depot, a lifeline for the advancing Canadians. But the real turning point came when the German 716th Infantry Division, tasked with holding the Juno sector, began to collapse. Individual soldiers surrendered, then squads, then entire platoons. By early afternoon, more than 2,000 German troops had given up, and entire defensive positions were abandoned. The Canadians had not only broken through the Atlantic Wall, they had shattered the enemy's will to fight. For American commanders, the lesson was impossible to ignore. The old rules had failed. The Canadians had proven that speed, aggression, and innovation could achieve what caution and tradition could not. The momentum doctrine born on Juno Beach would soon be studied in every U.S. military academy, changing the way America fought wars for generations to come. But the story wasn't over. The Canadians had seized the initiative, but new challenges loomed on the horizon. Could they hold their gains against German counterattacks? Would the rest of the Allies adapt to this new style of warfare? And what would happen when the world finally recognized the true impact of Juno Beach? The answers would shape not just the outcome of D-Day, but the future of military strategy itself. By late morning on June 6, 1944, the impossible was happening on Juno Beach. The Atlantic Wall, Hitler's pride, the so-called impenetrable line of concrete, steel, and barbed wire, was crumbling. And it wasn't just brute force that brought it down. It was the relentless, innovative tactics of the Canadian troops, tactics that would soon become the envy of every American commander on the Normandy coast. The statistics rolling into Allied headquarters were almost unbelievable. By 10:00 a.m., Canadian forward positions were 5 miles inland. They had captured or destroyed more than 200 German fortifications. Their casualties, while significant, were running at about half of what Allied planners had predicted. The aggressive approach that so many American and British officers had warned would lead to disaster was, in fact, saving lives. The Canadians had turned the most heavily defended sector of D-Day into a breakthrough point, and the world was starting to take notice. American generals, who had watched the early hours of the assault with skepticism, now found themselves rethinking everything they knew about amphibious warfare. The old doctrine, slow, methodical, cautious, had been shattered. The Canadians had proven that speed and momentum could overwhelm even the most formidable defenses. Reports from the front lines described German soldiers abandoning their posts, entire units surrendering, and defensive positions being overrun before they could even mount a coordinated response. The psychological impact on the enemy was devastating. German officers, trained to expect a slow, grinding assault, were caught completely off guard by the pace and aggression of the Canadian advance. One German major, leading a regiment of the 716th Infantry Division, approached Canadian lines under a white flag by early afternoon. Through an interpreter, he explained that his entire regiment, over 800 men, wanted to surrender. They had never seen such relentless pressure. They had fought Americans and British before, but nothing like this. The Canadians, he said, attacked like men possessed. This wave of surrender was not an isolated incident. By 3:00 p.m., more than 2,000 German soldiers had given up across the Juno sector. Entire defensive networks, painstakingly built over 4 years, were collapsing in a matter of hours. The Atlantic Wall, once thought to be the ultimate barrier, now had a 9-mile-wide hole punched straight through it. The speed of the Canadian advance created new challenges, ones that American logisticians would study for years to come. Supply lines, expected to take days to establish, had to be thrown together in hours. Trucks and jeeps meant for later waves were rushed forward to keep up with the infantry and tanks pushing deep into the French countryside. The rapid pace also meant that Canadian troops were liberating French towns and villages far ahead of schedule. In places like Courseulles-sur-Mer and Bernières-sur-Mer, French civilians emerged from hiding, waving flags and cheering their liberators. Scenes of celebration that planners thought would take days to unfold were happening before lunch. American and British commanders, watching from their command posts, realized they were witnessing a revolution in military tactics. The Canadians had not only broken through the Atlantic Wall, they had broken the mold for how invasions would be fought from that day forward. The momentum doctrine was no longer just a theory. It was a proven formula for victory, and it was about to be adopted by armies around the world. But the story of Juno Beach was more than just a tale of tactics and technology. It was a story of underdogs who refused to be defined by past failures. The Canadians had carried the weight of Dieppe, the doubts of their allies, and the scorn of their enemies. They had something to prove, not just to the world but to themselves. And in the crucible of battle, that determination became their greatest weapon. As the sun set on June 6th, the Canadians dug in 9 miles from the beach, exhausted but victorious. They had achieved what the experts said was impossible. They had forced the entire Allied command, including the U.S. Army, to reconsider everything they thought they knew about winning wars. The collapse of the Atlantic Wall was not just a military victory. It was a triumph of innovation, courage, and the relentless spirit of those who refused to be underestimated. But the impact of Juno Beach was only beginning. In the days and weeks that followed, the lessons learned here would ripple through every level of Allied command, changing the course of World War II and the future of military strategy in America and beyond. As the dust settled over Normandy, the shockwaves from Juno Beach were only just beginning to spread. For American commanders, the events of June 6, 1944, became an urgent case study, one that would challenge the very foundation of U.S. military doctrine. The Canadians had not only shattered the Atlantic Wall, they had shattered expectations, forcing the world's most powerful military to ask a simple but uncomfortable question: had they been fighting the wrong way all along? In the days following D-Day, Allied headquarters buzzed with activity. Reports from the Canadian sector poured in, each more astonishing than the last. The numbers were impossible to ignore. The Canadians had advanced 9 miles inland, farther than any other Allied force. Their casualties, while real, were dramatically lower than predicted. They had liberated towns and villages ahead of schedule, and their relentless momentum had left German defenders in disarray. American staff officers, trained to analyze every detail, began to realize that something extraordinary had happened on Juno Beach. The ripple effect was immediate. Within 2 weeks, British units began incorporating elements of the Canadian approach into their own operations. Orders went out: maintain forward pressure, don't pause to consolidate unless absolutely necessary, keep the enemy off balance. The old doctrine of slow, methodical advances was quietly set aside. American forces, initially slower to adapt, soon followed suit. By July 1944, U.S. training manuals were being rewritten. The sacred 3-minute interval between landing waves was questioned. New emphasis was placed on speed, aggression, and the power of momentum. For many American officers, this was a moment of reckoning. Some admitted, privately and later publicly, that they had underestimated their Canadian allies. Others simply adopted the new tactics without acknowledging where they came from. But the truth was clear. The momentum doctrine born on Juno Beach was now shaping the future of American warfare. It would influence not just the battles of Normandy, but the campaigns that followed, from the breakout at St. Lo to the race across France and into Germany. The transformation was nothing short of revolutionary. What had been dismissed as reckless in June became standard practice by September. At Fort Benning and West Point, instructors began teaching the lessons of Juno Beach, sometimes under different names but always with the same core principles. Speed through the danger zone, continuous pressure, never give the enemy time to regroup. The Canadian approach, once doubted and even ridiculed, became the gold standard for offensive operations. But the ripple effect didn't stop at tactics. The story of Juno Beach became a powerful lesson in innovation and the value of the underdog. American military historians began to recognize that the most radical breakthroughs often come from those with the most to prove. The Canadians, dismissed as colonial troops, had turned their outsider status into an advantage. They had less to lose, more to gain, and a willingness to challenge the status quo that more established armies sometimes lacked. This lesson resonated far beyond the battlefield. In the years after World War II, American business leaders, scientists, and entrepreneurs would look to Juno Beach as a case study in disruptive thinking. The idea that innovation often comes from the margins, from those who are underestimated, overlooked, or doubted, became a guiding principle in fields as diverse as technology, sports, and the arts. The Juno effect became shorthand for the power of bold ideas and relentless execution. Yet, for all the impact, recognition for the Canadians and their commander, Major General Rod Keller, was slow to arrive. In the immediate post-war years, American memoirs and military journals began to credit the Canadian contribution. General Omar Bradley, in his widely read memoirs, devoted pages to what he had witnessed at Juno Beach, admitting that the experience had changed his understanding of warfare. Other American officers followed suit, giving lectures and writing articles that highlighted the Canadian innovation. By the 1950s, military historians on both sides of the Atlantic were calling Juno Beach one of the most successful amphibious assaults in history. The broader lesson was clear. Sometimes, the greatest advances come from those who refuse to accept limits, who dare to break the rules, and who fight not just for victory, but for respect. The legacy of Juno Beach lives on in every American military academy, every business school case study, and every story of an underdog who changed the game. The ripple effect of that one day in June 1944 continues to shape how America thinks about leadership, innovation, and the power of having something to prove. But perhaps the most important lesson is this: never underestimate the outsiders, because sometimes the ones you doubt the most are the ones who end up changing the world. As the echoes of battle faded from the beaches of Normandy, the story of Juno Beach became more than just a chapter in military history. It became a blueprint for American innovation, resilience, and the relentless spirit of the underdog. For decades, U.S. military leaders, historians, and entrepreneurs have looked back at that day, searching for the secret ingredient that turned a group of underestimated Canadian soldiers into the architects of one of World War II's most stunning victories. The answer, it turns out, is as relevant in America's boardrooms and classrooms as it is on the battlefield. Juno Beach wasn't just about tactics or technology. It was about the power of having something to prove. The Canadians, dismissed as colonials and haunted by the memory of Dieppe, refused to accept the limits others placed on them. They didn't just want to win. They wanted to rewrite the rules, to show the world that innovation often comes from those who are overlooked, doubted, or underestimated. This lesson has echoed through every corner of American life. In Silicon Valley, the world's most disruptive companies are often started by outsiders, immigrants, college dropouts, or dreamers who refuse to play by the old rules. In sports, the greatest upsets come from teams that nobody believed in, fueled by the same determination that drove the Canadians across Juno Beach. In science, breakthroughs are made by those willing to challenge conventional wisdom, to take risks, and to keep moving forward even when the odds seem impossible. The U.S. military, too, has embraced this mindset. The momentum doctrine born on Juno Beach is now standard in every American officer's training. The idea that speed, aggression, and relentless pressure can break even the strongest defenses has shaped U.S. strategy from the Cold War to the present day. American Special Operations Forces, known for their rapid, decisive actions, owe a debt to the lessons learned on that stretch of French sand. But perhaps the most powerful takeaway is this: never underestimate the power of being underestimated. The Canadians at Juno Beach didn't have the biggest reputation, the flashiest equipment, or the loudest voices in the room. What they had was grit, creativity, and a refusal to accept defeat. They turned skepticism into fuel, doubt into determination, and adversity into advantage. In doing so, they didn't just win a battle, they changed the way America and the world thinks about what's possible. Today, as new challenges emerge and the pace of change accelerates, the Juno Beach story is more relevant than ever. In a world where innovation is the key to survival, whether in business, technology, or national security, the lesson is clear. The next big breakthrough might not come from the biggest player or the most established expert. It might come from the outsider, the underdog, the one with something to prove. So the next time you hear someone say, "It can't be done," remember Juno Beach. Remember the Canadians who broke the rules, defied expectations, and forced the world's most powerful military to rethink everything. Remember that sometimes the greatest advantage isn't strength or experience. It's the hunger to prove yourself, the courage to innovate, and the relentless drive to keep moving forward. Because in America, as on Juno Beach, the spirit of the underdog isn't just a story from the past. It's the engine of the future.